Dr. Heward's going to be a half hour late maybe, and who else did we hear from?
I know that John's got to head out in a little while, in 45 minutes.
John's got to head out in a little bit, yep.
Senator Morgan will not be joining us today.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So who's it look like we're missing?
It looks like Dave Ryan. I don't recall. Let me check and see if I have anything from Dave. I don't think so.
I don't see anything there.
Okay.
And let's see, we got Mel on board. Iris is on board. Chris is on board. I think, and we've got Mary. I think we've got everybody we're going to get for right now. What do you think, Bruce?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, great. Then we'll get things going. It's just a couple minutes after 2. We'll call to order the Commission to Study School Funding. Today's July 20th, 2020. And as we do in consistency with the governor's emergency order, we will begin with a roll call of who we've got here on the meeting. So please indicate. Well, actually, per the emergency order, you're supposed to indicate if there's anybody else in the room with you. I know we tend to take it a little further than that, and say where we're at, and particularly announce our pets, so which I think has actually been sort of a fun thing to do. So I'll start. Dave Luno reporting from Hopkinton with Ozzy the long-haired dachshund. Next up, Mel.
Mel Myler reporting from cool Port Clyde, Maine.
And how about Dick Ames?
Yeah, I'm reporting from Jaffrey in my home.
Great. And Rick
Alone.
Ladd? Oh, I'm sorry.
Alone.
All right. Rick Ladd?
And Rick Ladd is present in the New Hampshire Haverhill.
Thanks, Rick. And Jay Kahn?
Present in Stoddard by myself.
Okie doke. And Senator Morgan's not going to be able to make it today, but I saw Bill Ardinger here.
Yes, sir. Hello, everybody. I'm in Concord, New Hampshire, and with my wife in the house.
Great. Thanks, Bill. And Jane Bergeron?
Jane Bergeron here in Litchfield and home alone.
Great. And thank you, Jane. And Corinne Cascadden?
Corinne Cascadden, home alone in Berlin, New Hampshire.
Right. And I don't see David Ryan, so hopefully he'll be joining us shortly. John Beardmore.
John Beardmore, Hopkinton, New Hampshire, alone in the room, but not alone in the house.
Okay. Thanks, John. And Iris Estabrook.
Hi, at home in Barrington. No one's in the immediate vicinity.
Thanks, Iris. And Barbara Tremblay.
Hi, Barbara Tremblay, Keene, husband in the other room. Hi, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Barbara. And Chris Dwyer.
In my Portsmouth office alone.
Okie doke. And Susan's going to join us, I think, in about a half hour. But we've got Val Zanchuk's here.
Yes, Val Zanchuk, captain of industry in my office in Jaffrey. I always like that term. It's very turn of the century, Gilded Age.
Thanks, Val. And let's see, we've got Mary Heath.
Mary Heath in Manchester. I have my granddaughters running in and out, but basically I'm home alone. My husband's out there with them.
Great, great. Thanks, Mary. And let's see, we also have Jen 4.
Hi, Jen 4 calling from Concord, New Hampshire, home alone.
Great, thanks, Jen. And then we've got our team from the Carsey School. We've got Jordan Hensley.
Jordan Hensley here in Dover. My fiance is in the other room.
Okay, and I see Carrie Potry.
Harry Portree, calling in from Dover. I'm alone in my apartment.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. And Bruce Mallory.
Calling in from Kittery Point. Family members are around the house.
Okay. And I forgot, is Michelle joining us today?
Don't think so.
Okay.
But we do
And,
have Matt Girding is with us. Want to make sure we.
Oh, yeah. And Matt Girding.
Hi,
How are
folks.
you, Matt?
I'm good. How are you?
Great.
Calling in from Somersworth by myself.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Matt. And we've got some guest speakers for us this afternoon. We've got Ann Edwards. Welcome, Ann.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
And we've got Anne Marie French.
Yes, good afternoon, Anne Marie. I'm calling in from Dover, here alone.
Great. Thanks, Anne Marie. And we've got Phil Slatton.
Hi, Phil Sletton calling in from Henniker. My partner is several old farmhouse walls away, so she should be on me during the presentation.
Terrific, terrific. Well, thanks, everybody.
I just think we should let the record show that Mr. Sletton actually put on a coat and tie for this meeting, unlike the rest of us.
Well, the video from this is being recorded for posterity and posted on the website, so the formality will not go unrecognized. So, Phil, thanks very much. I hope you've got air conditioning.
No, I don't have air conditioning, but the first floor of the house stays remarkably cool,
Okay.
which we didn't expect when we bought it.
Well, if you got to take the tie off, feel free. So, all right. Let's see. Jordan, how are we looking as far as access is concerned?
We're looking good.
All right, great. And let's see, just a couple of comments before we get started. It's really just a replay of a little bit of what we talked about last week. Jay and Mel are going to be holding a joint meeting of House and Senate Education Committees tomorrow, starting at 9 o'clock in the morning. And the purpose of which is to review the plan for the reopening of public schools. And so we're going to be joined beginning at 9 a.m. sharp by the Commissioner of Education, and then followed by several panels from including school administrators to special education, access services, transportation, CTE, faculty and staff, and then followed by a discussion amongst the members of the joint committee. So that's scheduled, I think, from starting at 9, probably going through 12:30, something like that. So I think the coordinates to access the meeting are posted on the House and Senate calendars. So actually, I could probably pull one up here, but then you'd have to sort of cut and paste it anyway. So you know what, we can send that out. Why don't we do that just so that everybody has it easily one click away. And I don't know, Mel, Jay, anything you want to add to that?
Good. It's going to have probably 15 different presenters. It's really going to be a packed morning, but we're playing a little catch up with our legislative colleagues, and but we've had great cooperation from people to want to share their impressions of where we are currently in envisioning startup schools, and some concerns that they may have, that and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, this is an opportunity for legislators to basically, for the first time, have an opportunity to meet and really look at what are some of the issues that are facing school districts as they contemplate their process for opening up of schools. And it will be, I think it'll be a very full day, full morning, as we do a little bit of fact finding on exactly how the proposed guidelines will be implemented.
Right. Thanks, Mel. So, so anybody interested in joining us tomorrow, we'll make sure a link goes out to everybody. I know there's going to be some discussion about costs incurred or special costs incurred as a result of the reopening and the guidance supplied by the state. So there may or may not have bearing on some of the adequacy discussions and deliberations, but I think it's going to be it's certainly going to be very interesting. Let's see, a week from today, just actually, are we going to be doing calendar at all on here, Bruce?
Wasn't planning on it. We certainly can do that after
I'm
the
just
presentations.
yeah, just going to make a note. 1 week from today, we've got work groups. Actually, on Thursday this week, we also had the adequacy work group. No, 1 week today.
Yes.
1 week today is our big day. Sorry. Yeah, is our retreat day, and so we'll be starting, I think, a little bit earlier, 1 o'clock maybe, 1:30.
1 o'clock to 4:30.
1 o'clock to 4:30.
We'll send out a reminder, and later on in this meeting, we'll talk a little bit about how that extended work session will be organized and topics to be focusing on.
Okay, great. So we'll save that till towards the end of this meeting. Bruce, you want to remind people a little bit about group agreements?
Sure. Let me just post those up here as a quick reminder. Being open-minded, listening first, find a disagree, but don't personalize it. Focus on the idea, not the person. We've had some wonderful, a range of perspectives being expressed in the commission, and I think that'll only intensify as our work goes forward. So this is a great one to continue to honor. Except working through conflict, that also connects to what I just said, because that's the only way we're going to learn how to land this plane. It's okay to put issues like race and class and other forms of equity and inequity on the table. Be purposeful and to the point. Notice if what you're conveying is or isn't pertinent to the topic at hand. Always a challenge for people like me that are professors. Take risks, be raggedy, make some mistakes, and then let go. And finally, we all take responsibility for a productive process.
Great. Thank you very much, Bruce. And then before we move into presentations, one order of business is to take a look and approve the minutes from our July 13th meeting. So if everybody's given a look-see to those, I'd take a motion to approve the minutes of our meeting held July 13th, 2020.
So moved.
Second.
Second it.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion? I read through the minutes. I'd like to just have one amendment that I think the meeting was held on July 13th and the minutes say July 14th. But any other material changes anybody wants to, I mean, I had to look back in my calendar to make sure it was on the 13th. I couldn't imagine what I'd do like 6 months from now. So anyway, any further changes, amplifications, corrections? Then we'll just go through. I'll start. Luno, yes. Myler?
Yes.
Ames?
Yes.
Ladd?
Yes.
Khan?
Yes.
Ardinger?
Yes.
Bergeron?
Yes.
Cascadden?
Yes.
Beardmore?
Yep.
Estabrook?
Yes.
Tremblay?
Yes.
Dwyer?
Yes.
Sanchuk?
Yes.
Keith?
Yes.
Anybody I miss? All right, so the minutes carry. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bruce to introduce our guests this afternoon.
Let's see, first up is Ann Edwards, who is Associate Attorney General in the New Hampshire Department of Justice and the Attorney General's office. Ann has been key to that department's continuing review of school funding formula in New Hampshire relative to policy as well as litigation. She has not been, as I understand it, and can correct me, but she has not been, defendant's attorney in Claremont or subsequent Conval. litigation or other litigation, but rather she's been a resource expert, as it were, within the department to track the ways in which we fund public schools in New Hampshire over time have aligned with the interests of the Attorney General's office. So that's a broad general way of framing it. But as you see on the agenda, what she's going to provide for us is an historical overview of the school funding formula that have been applied in New Hampshire over the last couple of decades at least. And that's it. And Ann can continue to further introduce herself. And she's on audio with us today, so we'll listen closely and take notes, and then have time for questions and follow-up after her presentation. So Ann, thank you for making the time today. I know you have a busy summer and you're trying to juggle a lot of things, so we appreciate your joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce, for the introduction. I have been with the Attorney General's office since 1996, and I became involved in education funding matters starting in January of 1998. So in December of 1997, Claremont 2 was issued by the Supreme Court, and Marty Hohenberg and I were then assigned by the Attorney General, who was Phil McLaughlin at the time, to work with the legislature and at that time Governor Shaheen to create an education funding formula to respond. My one correction to Bruce's introduction of me is I have actually been the state's lead counsel on all education funding cases since 1998 until we came to the Conval, the current Conval case. At that time, it was time to pass the baton. So Anthony Galdieri, who is now head of litigation here, as well as Dan Will, who is the Solicitor General, are now the lead counsel on that case, but I'm also involved in that one too, just sort of more behind the scenes. So I like to say I have lived experience in New Hampshire's education funding, at least for the last couple of decades. And what I want to do quickly is sort of go through the basics of the plans up to the current plan, and then leave more time for questions than anything else. So in 1998, the first plan that was offered was the ABC Education Plan. That plan never went to its final state because instead it was sent by the legislature to the Supreme Court to question whether it was a constitutional plan. There's an opinion of the justices in that one, and the challenge with that was the statewide property tax. As many of you will remember, I'm sure, in the beginning, there were attempts to use a statewide property tax to fund the bulk of the cost of an adequate education, but to try to do that with a way so that no town or city was paying money into the state. And that got us hooked up a couple of different times at the Supreme Court, with the Supreme Court stating that that wasn't a constitutional tax because it wasn't uniform at a uniform rate across the state. So the ABC plan went down. In April of 1999, Chapter Law 17 was passed, in which there was a per pupil grant for every student in the state for what would fund an adequate education. There were some weights included with that grant for special education and free and reduced lunch, and it was funded by what was called the Uniform Education Property Tax at that time, as well as a mixture of other state taxes, which include revenue from lottery. It had a phase-in of the property tax. So we learned our lesson to make sure it was a uniform rate at that time, but we attempted to phase it in over a couple of years to try to sort of mitigate the impact on the towns that were in the cities that were going to pay in. And that was challenged to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said no to a phase-in. So then it was reenacted in November of 1999 under Chapter Law 338. And the property tax rate at that time was set at $6.60 per thousand. And relief was built into it for individuals who are low or moderate income taxpayers, so that to mitigate the impact of the increase in the tax on those individuals versus on the cities or towns. So that was the first funding formula that essentially passed constitutional muster and was able to go into effect for a period of time. In September of 2001, the Claremont plaintiffs moved to have Chapter Law 338 declared unconstitutional. Partially what they were looking at was that there was no definition of an adequate education at that time. And so in April of 2002, the court said that the formula could continue, but that the state needed to define an adequate education. And that really was the responsibility of the legislature to do that. So the legislature did define an adequate education ultimately, and Chapter 338's formula was modified in 2003 under Chapter Law 241:8, and that was one of the formulas that started having some targeting of additional aid. And so we'll talk about that in several of the bills, and the targeting is all done slightly differently depending on which bill it was. But that bill in particular had $10 million that was set aside to be distributed to municipalities with lower medium family income. Unfortunately, a mistake was made in the calculation of that, and the Department of Education used median household income, which caused some municipalities to be underpaid by $1.2 million, and that had to be corrected. And that was one of the challenges, and has been one of the challenges at different times with the funding formulas, because at times we're looking back at data that's a year old or up to 3 years old in the past. And so sometimes there have been corrections to the data, or corrections are made after payments are made, and it becomes challenging, and there have been mistakes in the funding formulas which have ended up costing the state more money to correct. In 2004, Chapter Law 200 established a statewide education property tax with a floating rate. And so essentially it would be, along with sort of the mix of state funds that we always have in there, including lottery, it would be a tax rate that could fund as much of the cost of adequacy as the legislature chose to have it fund. There was a per pupil cost that was the basis of what was going to be paid to municipalities for the cost of an adequate education. And that per pupil cost was going to be based on what had been calculated for fiscal year 2004 as the per pupil cost. And it was then set to be adjusted by the average annual rate of inflation. That would be based off the preceding 4 years. It also included a targeted aid at that time directed to municipalities with students who are receiving free or reduced lunch, and any of the municipalities that were considered property poor because they had an equalized valuation per pupil that was 90% or less than the statewide average equalized tax valuation per pupil. That's a horrible phrase. But communities could receive both of those aids under that formula if they qualified for it. So if they had a high free and reduced lunch rate, they could receive aid, and they could also receive aid if they were property poor based on the definition. In January 2005, the statewide property tax was challenged by 33 taxpayers, and this is the first time we really start hearing the argument from municipalities that they are donor towns or donor cities. And that lawsuit was tried in August of 2007. The Supreme Court issued an order finding that the statewide property tax was constitutional based on, that is the Sorrell case, by the way, based on the tax itself. The challenge was that the assessment system for the communities was problematic because the Constitution requires a reassessment of property values every 5 years, and many of our municipalities were not doing that. So as a result, we had to agree to fix the assessment system, but the tax continued on, and the tax has continued on in essentially the same format with some changes to what its rate is. In 2005, Chapter Law 257, which was known as House Bill 616, was passed with a new education funding system. This was the first formula, and I think the only formula, that didn't have a general per pupil aid amount. It used 4 types of aid, and those types of aid included a local tax capacity aid, a statewide enhanced education tax aid, and transition grants. It did include a targeted per pupil aid for students who fall into the sort of typical categories of weights and factors, as they're called often, which are students who receive free and reduced lunch, students who are special education students, and students who are English language learners. So those factors in particular, and sometime also including like a median income factor, have been used for a really long time. Those predate the adequacy formula, and they are weights that the state was sort of used to dealing with and understood how they could be used as proxies for other costs. And in Chapter Law 257, the property tax rate was set to raise $363 million. So this was another modification to the property tax, and in this case, the legislature determined how much it wanted the property tax to raise rather than allowing it to be a floating rate. This education formula in 2005 was challenged by Nashua and Londonderry in August of 2005. Londonderry's case was the one that was ultimately decided by the Supreme Court. And in that case, what the Supreme Court said is that the legislative record didn't support a determination that the funds that were being distributed under that formula were connected to the state's responsibility to provide the opportunity for an adequate education. So as a result, in September of 2006, the Supreme Court held that it was the legislature's job to define a constitutionally adequate education. And the court, and this is one of the areas of the decisions that has caught us, I think, the most. The Supreme Court also said that in creating the definition for an adequate education, the state had to create it in such a way that there could be an objective determination of the costs of that education, and that whatever the state identifies as constitutional adequacy, it must pay for. None of that financial obligation can be shifted to the school districts, regardless of their relative wealth or need. And so that's one of the areas that catches us, because whatever the state determines is constitutional adequacy, the state has to pay for. In January of 2007, House Bill 927, which became Chapter Law 270, was passed. It defined what an adequate education was and the curriculum frameworks for that education. It also established an education costing commission, and we have had a couple of costing commissions during the time period since the first ABC plan. And those costing commissions are made up of legislative members, and they usually have experts who are brought before them, sometimes from the state, sometimes from individuals or different think tanks who want to bring information to the legislature to consider while it's creating a new funding formula. In 2008, Chapter 173, which at that time was also known as Senate Bill 539, was the Legislative Cost Committee's recommendation. It created an accountability system and a formula using different factors. We also see in 2008, for the first time, I believe, in Chapter 384, kindergarten comes into the picture. And kindergarten was required at that time to be instituted by 2009 to the 2010 school year. That also was challenged, but the challenge to that law was dismissed. So kindergarten over time has been something that was coaxed for the school district, then something that was paid for the school district at a half rate, and then I believe it's now at a full day kindergarten if communities have chosen to do that. In 2009, there were changes made to the funding formula through Chapter 198, also known as Senate Bill 180 at the time. It modified the funding formula so that there was a universal cost established for the cost of an adequate education, and that at that time, if there were students who needed additional funding for special education, English language learners, or a family with median income that was below the state average, then those were included in what was known as differentiated aid. There was also fiscal capacity disparity aid that was for communities that had very high free and reduced lunch counts. And in those cases, hold on one second, I'm just trying to find a note on that. In those cases, the fiscal disparity aid was based on equalized valuation per pupil. And if it was less than half of the state's average equalized valuation, then those communities received aid with respect to the need. There was a recognition at this time by the legislature that communities that had higher pockets or concentrations of poverty needed more funding for those individuals. So there was, if a community had, I believe it was 25% of its students at a free or reduced lunch, receiving free or reduced lunch, then they moved to receiving a significantly higher amount of money in order to make sure that the money was available to those communities to be able to have the resources to educate those students. In 2011, Chapter 258, which was known as House Bill 337 at that time, followed the 2009 formula with universal costs, which they referred to as base costs, and additional funds based on the student population, but it repealed the fiscal capacity disparity aid, which is that additional funding that was given to communities based on the concentrations of poverty in certain communities. And at that time, the legislature moved to stabilization grants to make sure that no district received less than it would have received in fiscal year 2011. So those formulas were put in place at that time. And this is the first time as well that there is a provision for charter schools. So that's sort of the history. I mean, the current formula uses a per pupil cost. It uses factors to provide additional funding for students with additional needs. And it's been essentially the system with modifications over time since the ABC plan. One of the things when I talked to Attorney General McDonald a couple of weeks ago about speaking with the commission, he asked me a question about whether at any point the Attorney General's office had taken the position that any education funding formula had to be a per pupil based formula, to which I then declared, having been involved in this so long, I can't remember everything we've said. And I certainly can't remember anything specifically in which we ever said that the formulas had to be per pupil. I think one of the reasons they have them per pupil is because at the time when all of this began, back in the late 1990s, that was sort of what states around the country were using as a way to establish a formula. It also was part of what we had been using in the past for aids to communities who needed assistance with education. So it was a formula that was known, but I don't believe that it's required under any of the decisions. I think the challenge is we have to be able to meet the Londonderry standard of if we as a state declare what constitutional adequacy is, then we have to be ready to fund it. So I would be happy to answer any questions I can.
Dave, do you want to handle the question?
Yeah, I just had to unmute. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Anne, for laying out that the history and the timeline there. That was really informative. I've got one quick question, and then I'm just going to open it up. But when the Attorney General asked you about if any of the court decisions had ever required per pupil cost, I've heard people talk about, oh well, you know, maybe we can get away from per pupil cost, but what are examples of some of the alternative ways of doing it not on a per pupil basis?
So I think the way it can be done is a determination could be used similar to the formula that was used in 2005, where I think there can be a determination regarding how to establish local aid based on how you'd probably still have to use a student population number of some amount, but you could determine what amount of money generally the state believes would be needed to run a school, and that depending on how large the school is, or I guess I'm trying to think of what sort of the different factors could be. In that bill in 2005, or that law, they were looking at, one of the things they were looking at was the local tax capacity aid, and that could be used sort of for the additional funding above adequacy, but I think it would be problematic for the funding below. So I think that the legislature certainly could make a determination on, here's how much we think it is to run a school. So you look at kind of the basic components of a school with whatever staffing needs you have, whatever you know, the principal, the superintendent, the school nurse, the librarian, all of those sort of additional costs, and the legislature could determine essentially what the cost to run a school is. And there could be a determination as to how to figure out the difference between the cost for that, running that school in Manchester versus the cost of running that school in Pittsburgh. And you could use a formula like that.
Okay, Anne, thanks very much. That's helpful. Iris, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty much where I was going with my question. And hi, Iris Estabrook. We've been on this trip together a long time.
We have, Senator. Good to hear from you.
You too. And I'm really glad you brought up that basic point, because that's, I think, where some of the other members of the commission and I have been going back and forth, because my memory was really strong that we were told the state had to pay for whatever we defined as adequacy. And yet people were looking at a way to get away from the per pupil allocation. What you proposed is sort of a small opening in a door or window in that direction. However, as you said, you'd still have to account for population of that school somehow and figure out ways to target that money to the poorest districts. But what I'm concerned about And we know that part of our history together, which you didn't mention, was the whole effort to pass a constitutional amendment to allow the state to do only targeting and not have that requirement of paying for a base adequacy. And that was repeatedly rejected. Part of the reason it was, and part of the reason I remain concerned somewhat about redefining the state's obligation in a way where we're not fully obligated, is the issue of where you then draw the floor. If you have a base adequacy amount, you have an amount below which the state cannot minimize its obligation. And the adequacy work group was discussing this right after having had a presentation on school building aid. And what happened to school building aid is exactly an example of what I fear may happen were we to do away with a minimal state obligation, in that it was put on moratorium for 10 years. When it was brought back, only enough money was allocated to pay standing obligations and a very, very, very few projects each year. So I wonder if you move away from a base adequacy as a state obligation, how you ensure that the state meets some floor of obligation, and how does that floor get established?
And those are excellent questions. I think the best way you could do it is by establishing a formula similar to what I was discussing before with this is the cost to run a school in New Hampshire, and to make sure that that school that's built as the basis for the formula has the components that everyone believes are necessary for a school in order to be constitutionally adequate. And I think that's the way you could do it. It is true that a constitutional amendment is definitely an option, and I should have included the fact that that is something that could occur. It obviously has to be passed by the people. But unless we get a constitutional amendment, we're stuck with the decisions of the Supreme Court, which in particular the Londonderry decision that tells us that once we define adequacy, we have to pay for it. And as always, we can target above adequacy all we want. So any additional money that the legislature chooses to send to schools based on different concerns, such as poverty or not enough property wealth in a community, the legislature has the right to do that, but it has to be after adequacy or above adequacy.
Great. Questions for Ann Edwards? Bill, and then Jay.
Hello, thank you. And hello, Ann. I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing great, Bill. It's nice to hear from you. I hope you are too.
I wish we could see you. It's great to hear from you. You know, New Hampshire obviously is not the only state that has faced Supreme Court or judicial intervention in their school funding schemes. Massachusetts in 1993 experienced the same thing. Massachusetts' response was have the legislature get very active to identify that the problem was that towns like New Bedford and their children were being denied access to a quality educational opportunity, whereas towns like Wellesley, the children were not having that problem. And so the legislature's response to that was to target aid in a new formula that was robust. And under that formula, for example, New Bedford's adequacy or foundation amount might be determined to be, let's just say $14,000 per pupil, and the state gave aid of $12,000 per pupil. Whereas in Wellesley, the adequacy number was different because of a lot of factors like the ones you're identifying. In Wellesley, the number was maybe $10,000 per pupil, and the state aid was $2,000 a pupil. And so what happened was the state response was to correct the policy problem, which is towns like Claremont and their children getting an unfair deal compared to towns that were wealthier and had better resources. I'm nervous that in listening to you describe the Londonderry decision, that it's almost as if the Supreme Court in New Hampshire uniquely said the legislature doesn't have enough authority, doesn't have the constitutional power to address the core problem, which is to help the kids who are most in need. I'm really nervous because that obviously would be a terrifically constraining factor in a state like New Hampshire that has, you know, some of the highest ranked public schools in the country. We spend the highest amounts per pupil. We're number 10 nationally per pupil on average. Our system isn't broken everywhere. It's broken in the plaintiff communities, even 20 plus years after the Claremont decision. You know, I'd like you to address the thought that the court may have constrained New Hampshire's legislature so much more rigidly than the court in Massachusetts or in other states.
Well, I do think the challenge that we have, because I'm not necessarily familiar with the very current Massachusetts formula, but I certainly was very familiar with it during the time period that we are creating all the additional formulae that we created in the 2000s and early 2010s. And the challenge is that sometimes you get what you ask for, and we kept sort of pushing and pushing at this until we ended up with the Londonderry decision. And the Londonderry decision was not welcomed in a lot of places. It was welcomed in other places, but it is concerning, and it still is concerning, because that language is very clear. The language I read to you is a quote from the Londonderry case. And I do think that it has put the legislature in a position where the legislature has to, in order to do anything more with targeting, it has to find a way to define adequacy in a formula where it can pay the same adequacy amount to Hollis that it can pay to Franklin, and then be able to target above that. So the students in Franklin receive the targeting funding, but the students in Hollis still receive the adequacy formula. I hear your concern, Bill, and it's a concern that many legislators have expressed to us over the years, but I just have the language of the case. And does it mean that the Supreme Court wouldn't change its position? No, it doesn't mean that. I mean, the court might look at that now and make it. We haven't challenged Londonderry, and so it may be that the Supreme Court will look at this and have a different sort of view of it. And we have Conval up there right now. It's really not up there squarely on that issue, but the court has the ability to look at its previous decisions. But I think it is a problem. I think it's a restrictive decision, and I think that the way around it, if there is one, is to be creative in how adequacy is established.
So that's a sad answer. That to think that we're that, because didn't the court also said that the legislature has wide latitude to structure an answer. So, but thank you so much, Ann, for your presentation today. I really appreciate it.
So Ann, before I head over to Joe, I just wanted to back up on a point you just made with respect to the Londonderry decision, and I guess with Bill's comment in the background that the legislature doesn't have the power to help kids with the most need. But didn't you talk about in years from 2005 on where the legislature in its adequacy determination factored in special education, English language learners, free and reduced, which is a proxy for poverty, median household income. We refer to these as weights, differential aid, equalized value per pupil was factored in. Things were later scrapped for stabilization grants, which I think are part of adequacy. So I mean, aren't a lot of the factors that that I think anybody would reasonably consider as part of a district, or, you know, the most vulnerable districts or families or kids with needs. Can't those costs be factored into the cost of adequacy?
They certainly can be, and I just want to clarify because all of the items, and I gave a lot of information, and it's not necessarily helpful to get all of that, especially verbally. So I certainly could put my summary in writing, and then that might be a little more helpful to folks, but not all of those are adequacy. In most formulas, the weights or the factors that I'm referring to are, which include English language learners, free and reduced lunch, and special education. Those are the three most common in the different formulae. Those even pre-existed back in foundation aid prior to adequacy. When it comes to other money like stabilization grants and fiscal disparity capacity aid and some of the other targeted aids, those aids tend to be above adequacy. So
Okay.
Adequacy is met with a per pupil cost and those three weights that I referred to. Sometimes medium income or median household income is added in as a weight, but many times it's above adequacy, and it's used to specifically target additional aid beyond adequacy to the communities that the legislature believes needs it.
Okay. No, that's very helpful, and thank you very much. Yeah, and yeah, if it's not a huge inconvenience to put that in, you know, in writing so that we can have it for the record, that would be terrific, because I think we'll definitely be referring to this as we try to plot our, you know, path forward. We certainly want to have a full understanding of what's been done and tried before. So Jay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, good discussion. Thanks, Ann. Ann, I'm a state senator, chair of the education committee for 4 years. I've been studying our statutes, and so I want to ask about where you went regarding constitutional adequate education. Because our Constitution doesn't ever say adequate education. Our Constitution says the opportunity and advantages of education. So the thought that we have developed a cost of an adequate education versus the cost of the opportunity for an adequate education, we've left out the word, the word that's in the Constitution. And I just keep questioning how we are at this place of defining some subset of what our statutes in total are describing what the obligations are for school districts providing that education or that opportunity.
So if I very likely may have left out the word opportunity, because sometimes when I speak on this, I shorthand it. And if I did that, I apologize, because it's actually written in several places in my notes, because it's very important to know that we are offering the opportunity for an adequate education. We are not offering the opportunity, we are not offering guaranteeing an adequate education, because it's up to students to take advantage of that opportunity. So it should be opportunity. And I think the challenge is early on, we worked with the legislature on how to sort of phrase what it was that the legislature was doing. And there were the legislature's wish was that it be defined as the opportunity for a constitutionally adequate education, because the legislature wanted boundaries around what an adequate education was. So not everyone could just come in and say, well, to me, an adequate education, at the time, kindergarten would have been an example, or even preschool, because those were argued often. And the legislature at that time, in the beginning of this, didn't believe either one of those levels of education were necessary for a constitutionally adequate education. So I certainly I always view it as the opportunity for a constitutionally adequate education. And I apologize if I didn't do that. And so I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think we're in agreement that it's the legislature's decision to define what a constitutionally adequate education is.
Yeah. Well, or the opportunity for that.
Right.
So if it is the opportunity and not so much a defined set of things, but that what we now are defining as adequate is one section of one chapter of 14 chapters that define educational standards that then get defined in rules and have, all right, I don't need to tell you that there's a lot of stuff out there that school districts need to administer to make sure that there's that opportunity. What distinguishes the opportunity is the capacity of a district, the assets of both the abilities of a child and the abilities of a community to provide that opportunity, because it winds up being unequal when the assets of the family, of the child's ability, or the community to support that, that's what interferes with the opportunity. So that we've gotten ourselves to this place where the same adequacy amount to all schools, it seems like it's avoiding what the constitutional obligation is.
And I hear what your concern is. I think that, again, as I said in the beginning, there are different ways to define adequacy. And my example was, here's what it costs to run a school, and you can make that as adequacy. I think that you certainly could include in a definition of adequacy, or the opportunity to provide constitutional adequacy, is that a community needs to have a tax base of such and such in order to do that, or a community needs to have a median household income of such and such. And then if a community doesn't have that, you could build that amount into a base cost for the opportunity of an adequate education. And in doing that, that could allow you to target internally, which has been used at some times in some of the formulae, to internally in the adequacy amount, a way of directing or targeting aid, if you wanted to use something like that as a factor, because the legislature finds that that is what's necessary to provide the opportunity. And there are many parts to adequacy itself, because RSA 193E is the definition, and it includes some of the curriculum frameworks as part of it. RSA 193C is the statewide improvement and assessment program, and then you have the funding formula itself with its different factors in RSA 198. So there are different parts of adequacy, that all of which come into that definition in some way.
Yeah, and what I struggle with, Anne, is that the ability for a student to succeed is defined in many other statutes than just a set of curriculum guidance.
That's true.
And that creates an obligation on school districts, and we know that that starts to grow and add, but it's that, again, that the opportunities aren't the same in districts that don't have, and in students who don't have the same assets.
That's true. And the legislature definitely recognized that when it was working on the 2005 formula. That's one of the formulas. And also when it worked on the 2011 formula. Those are, or the 2009 one, the Senate Bill 180. Those are two of the formulas where the legislature focused in on what the challenges are within communities based on different needs. And those certainly can be built in and have been in the past built into the adequacy side of the formula.
Yeah, so long as it builds up from something as opposed to sets the floor for something.
Right. I think that's the challenge with it because of the Londonderry decision. And as Bill Ardinger pointed out, that's a tough decision. And so there are ways to take another run at it and see where that goes. But right now, if we define it as one of the costs for the opportunity, then we have to pay for it.
So Rick, I'm going to come to you in a second. So I'm taking that and what your dialogue here with Jay as being that that the court really hasn't limited the legislature in what it can consider as part of the cost of inadequate education, whether that's comparable educational outcomes, whether that's median household income or other disparities, economic disparities in a town or a district. Do I have that right?
Yes, you do. Like I said, in some ways, the focus ended up being on the per pupil amount because that was sort of what the state knew. And that's what a lot of communities were using, but it doesn't need to be the sole answer to this.
Okay, great. Rick, I saw you had your hand up and I know we're already 15 over.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. Hi, Ann, this is Rick Ladd.
Hi, Representative.
I'm looking back at what we did to this education formula through HB 337 in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the bill which really broke the camel's back here, where we took out the fiscal capacity aid, disparity aid, that just took away the median family income and the equalized valuation property, that amount that they got through that formula for the lower districts in the lower quartile? And we also got rid of reimbursement for special ed in terms of the formula which we had developed back and implemented in 2008, 2009, and did the same thing for free and reduce. We destroyed that and put it all, $150 million straight into stabilization, and then later went on and did the 4% deduct. I'm looking at that 2011 formula where we actually had a cap on growth. You had some districts on the southern end of the state that were not getting funded properly, seeing that they were not receiving the monies that their population demanded. And you also had a formula built upon per capita, and from 2005 to 2015, we lost more than 21,000 students in the state. So I guess I'm at a real quandary here do we have to dismantle our entire formula? Were we on track to getting something done correctly? Or do we just really need to relook at adequacy, how we determine that, and fund it not necessarily on per capita, but on program?
So I certainly would never say whether the legislature was on track or off track, because it's my job to support the legislature in the direction it wants to go and to perhaps advise if I think something's headed towards unconstitutional land. But I think that you can make changes to the formula as you choose to. One of the things you just referenced were the collars. And I didn't mention the collars, but the collars were in place. And the collars were put in place to make sure that no community received much lower community payment than it had been receiving, but also to make sure that no community received too much money, because that was one of the ways that we were able to make this work fiscally and pass it along. And it also was a concern that suddenly you could be flooding some school districts with a lot of money. And so collars were put in place, and then they remained in place for almost 10 years, which that would be the city of Dover, school district case in which the state, for the first time, conceded that something was likely unconstitutional, and it was the collars because they had remained in place for too long. But I don't believe at all that you couldn't make modifications, whether you'd have to pull the whole formula apart to do it, or whether you want to continue to work off the formula you have to make changes to it. I think you can do either one. And we're obviously happy to help you work on language and ideas that you have to be able to make that work. But I think you can go whichever direction it is that you choose to go.
Thank you, Ann.
Great. And I just, this is Dave Luna. I want to thank you for your time and for laying out the history and your help in terms of, particularly in terms of how we should look at some of these court rulings and what they mean for our latitude. So thank.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking me. Good luck, everyone. If we can help, let us know.
Fantastic. We will. So,
All
so
right.
the DOJ has been very helpful during this whole effort. So thanks again very much. Let's see. Next, and I apologize to Anne Marie and to Phil. We're running a few minutes behind, but we'll let you make that up on the tail end. So without any further, Bruce, I mean, you do such a great job introducing people. Why don't I hand it over to you, and then we'll get this started.
Well, thanks. Although I obviously misspoke when I introduced Anne. So I'll be careful here, but in any case, several members of the commission are aware of the kind of resource that the Fiscal Policy Institute has provided to the state now for a number of years. Their recent analyses of the state budget, legislative process around the state budget, in combination with analyses of economic conditions in the state, including local economic conditions. Several folks had asked that they share their information with us. In particular, and I think this actually dovetails really nicely on Anne's presentation, because it gets back at this concept of local fiscal capacity and disparities related to local fiscal capacity. So Anne Marie and Phil are going to walk us through a presentation on how it is you even measure those disparities across municipalities in terms of fiscal capacity and local economy. So as I say, I think these are two really complementary presentations, and I'll just turn it over to Anne Marie and Phil, and we'll take about 30 minutes or so for this presentation as well.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to present to the Commission today on the topic of measuring disparities in municipal economies and fiscal capacities. My name is Anne Marie French. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. We're an independent, nonprofit policy research organization based in Concord. As many of you know, we focus on the state budget, state revenue, health policy, and the state economy as it pertains to low and moderate income residents. So we've been examining this issue since 2018, when we sought to develop a better understanding of the economic conditions facing local communities across the state, both in terms of incomes and the economic security of residents, but also of the differing levels of resources that a community can tap into to fund services like education. So this research was published in our 2018 report, Measuring New Hampshire's Municipalities, Economic Disparities, and Fiscal Capacities, which is linked in today's meeting agenda. In 2019, we began building on this work, working with the Community Development Finance Authority to take the data indicators that we started in that report and help CDFA build a new set of data indicators to assess the economic conditions in local communities. And this work is ongoing right now. NHFPI Senior Policy Analyst Phil Slatton, he was the lead researcher on this project, and he's really going to provide the presentation today to outline the selected key data sets separately and present some new analysis that we've done recently that examines certain data related to community income and combination. We hope this information helps you to better understand the differing fiscal capacities and level of need in communities and helps to inform the work of this commission. So thank you again for this opportunity, and I'll just turn it over to Phil for the presentation. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Anne Marie, and thank you again to the Commission for its time and for its attention this afternoon. I want to make sure that everyone can see my screen. Hopefully you should all have a shot of what the slide deck looks like. Okay, great. So really what I want to talk to you about today is ways that we can measure what local economic conditions are and how that interacts with the capacity of those communities facing those local economic conditions to, to be able to pay for the services at the local level. So there are really 5 key takeaways that I want you to have from this presentation that we'll discuss throughout. First, measuring economic well-being comprehensively at the very local level, especially if you want to measure it consistently across municipalities in New Hampshire, is very difficult. There are limited options available in terms of usable data, and that you can apply to each municipality in the state, or even to most municipalities in the state. And there are data available that really aren't reliable. You may have some information about what may be happening at the local level, but those data may not have a high level of statistical certainty. Now, free and reduced price school meal eligibility and taxable property value per student, which we have already talked about some in this afternoon's meeting, are 2 key metrics for understanding community fiscal capacity and some of the challenges school districts may face, not only in terms of raising money to provide services, but also the service needs from the school district. There are other metrics, and we'll talk about some of them in this presentation, that capture a broader economic picture of a community, and those may be important for considerations of overall community fiscal capacity and the challenges that a community may face. I'll emphasize that no metric is perfect, but each provides different information, and used in combination, they can provide key insights as to a community's ability to invest in itself. And I'll note that that's important because access to opportunity and upward mobility within a community may be reduced in communities with a more limited ability to invest in themselves and particularly in their children. So to start off, free and reduced price school meals. And what percentage of the student population in each community is eligible for free and reduced price school meals. This is a more familiar metric. These estimates are a little older, they're a slightly older iteration, but do show the relative patterns across the state. And of course, you can see here, there's a strong regional component. Just a quick summary of the colors. Gray is about where the statewide average is for the percentage of students eligible for free or reduced price meals. The communities that are the darker colored greens have lower than that statewide average, and the communities that are the darker colored purples are higher than that statewide average. So there are these strong regional components, as you can obviously see in the southeastern part of the state versus some of the more rural parts of the state, but there are also both rural and urban communities right next to each other that have substantially different rates of free and reduced price meal enrollment. And that suggests rather different fiscal capacities in terms of the resources students have access to at home and the capacity to pay for local taxation at the community level, even within geographically proximate communities, even within neighboring communities in between them. Now, of course, the current education funding formula includes differentiated aid on a per student basis for free and reduced price school meals. The state fiscal year 2021 one-time aid included in the current state budget also includes a sliding scale of additional aid per student, which you can see here in this graph based on estimates from the Department of Education from November of 2019. Basically, moving left to right across this graph represents an increased proportion of the students, of the student body being eligible for free and reduced price school meals. The blue dots show the amount of additional dollars per student in this partially sliding scale, based on where the municipalities are, on that same scale of the percentage of students eligible. And the green dots show the number of students. So if you look at the right axis, you can see how many students are in each one of those municipalities, or residents of each one of those municipalities. Now, moving on to the another metric that we've already talked about some, taxable property wealth per student. So this is, or termed equalized valuation per pupil to be more precise. This measure is also included in the state fiscal year 2021 aid, and it's a very direct measure of fiscal capacity. The property tax base is obviously a very important component of the funding stream for school districts. So that capacity, in terms of how broad that property tax base is or how large it is very important for understanding what are the taxable resources available, right, to a school district. Now, the places with the highest levels of taxable property wealth per pupil tend to be those with a lot of property and relatively few students, as you might imagine. This is true particularly for more retirement-oriented destination communities around the state and more rural parts of the state that tend to have an older population overall, may have fewer families with children, but is also somewhat dependent on the chances of geography in terms of what is within the borders of that community. Either oceanfront or lakeshore property, and then commercial and industrial, larger commercial industrial facilities that aren't necessarily associated with a lot of population can also change what this calculus looks like. Now, of course, property taxes are critical to funding local schools. So both the property tax base and the ability of people to pay for those property taxes is a critical source of school district revenue. So here you can see in this pie chart, based on the school year 2017 to 2018 data, local taxation through property taxes is 62%, federal funds are about 5%, and then state aid, which are the two blue slices and the lighter green slice here, make up about 31% in total, with most of that coming from adequate education grants. That being said, that light green slice is the statewide education property tax, and that's a large portion of that state aid, and it is raised and retained locally. So taken together, property taxes that are levied locally were nearly 3/4 of all revenue for New Hampshire school districts. And other revenue sources, you can see selected other state revenue sources that support the Education Trust Fund. Those are included, or a selection of those, of larger ones of those are included in the graph as well. They are significant, but they're limited in comparison. And as such, when we're thinking about fiscal capacity in the community, that property tax base and people's ability to pay it is quite key. Now, the the property tax bases are also part of the formula for the one-time aid grants for education funding in state fiscal year 2021 in New Hampshire. Again, provided on a sliding scale, the estimates available when this analysis was completed suggested that about half the students lived in municipalities that were eligible for additional aid. So you can see on this graph, as you move along the x-axis, the horizontal axis, you have changes in the equalized valuation per pupil of a municipality. And these are all based on municipalities. And the additional aid per student is shown in that gray line, with each dot being a municipality, and the scale being on the left side of the graph. On the right side, you can see the number of students that are in each community based on their equalized valuation per pupil. So, for example, here, there are the most students in this section of equalized valuation per pupil. In this measure, that's Manchester. Nashua is the next tallest one. Not a surprise, given there are two largest communities in the state. And I'll also note that this graph ends at $1.5 million in taxable property wealth per student in that equalized valuation per pupil. About 13% of students lived in municipalities with more than that $1.5 million in taxable property wealth per student. So this graph doesn't include them because of the scaling. But that gives you a sense of where the students are relative to these equalized valuations. Now, zooming out a bit, if you broaden out from these two measures, another factor that you can think of is what is the total taxable property wealth per capita in a community? And when I say per capita, I mean not per student, but we're talking about per person. And that helps us understand the community's capacity to pay for all services, including education, and helps incorporate other non-education services into the picture relative to what there might be in terms of population needs. I'll note the scale is rather different here. We're talking about for the per pupil calculations, the color shading was capped at about $10 million and started down at $346,000. And here it's a range from about $40,000 to a cap at $1 million. And again, the colors pivot around what the statewide median is. So this map shows there are some different patterns, and the two metrics are not very different in general. Well, this one's a little more expansive, but again, we can see the high property values per capita, as with the student measures. What's happening in those communities is heavily informed by natural features such as lakefronts and coastlines, as well as large commercial and industrial facilities where populations are otherwise low. And we can see that there may be some changes here also based on the makeup of the population in those communities. one of the differences that we see, for example, when you're basing your, when your denominator is the number of students as opposed to the number of people, the age distribution matters a fair bit. This map shows the median age by municipality. Based on the 2010 census, we're looking forward to those 2020 census numbers, but this is the last time that we had a sort of complete count where we could measure the median age reliably in each community. And you can see there is some variation, again, based on where certain communities are that may be more attractive for folks to retire to. They may not have to worry about commuting to one particular area or another. And then also you could see on the other end of the spectrum areas where there are colleges and universities. And I'll note that you'll see on these maps, especially the town by town maps, there are communities that tend to be around the White Mountains and along the main border that are either white or completely removed from the map. Those are places where there's very little or no population, so the metric doesn't apply. So here, this tells us again, this informs what some of those trends that we see in taxable property values what may be behind them. Now, another thing, a key variable that we've already discussed a little bit, and the Commission has already discussed this afternoon, that we might want to measure to measure municipal fiscal capacity is what's the income in the community. And thanks to the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey, we can get a picture of household income at the county level to within a few $1,000s with some degree of confidence that that measure is actually telling us what the median household income in that community is. But these are based on survey data. The American Community Survey happens every year. This is a 5-year average of the data from 2014 to 2018. And we can say with some reliability, again, within a few $1,000s that we're 90% confident that this is what we're within a few $1,000s of these indicators. But this same data set is often not reliable at the municipal level because of the very small sample sizes. There just aren't that many people surveyed. Now, this county map does allow us to see what some of that regional variation is. So for example, Rockingham County's median household income is twice what it is in Coos County. And that tells us something right there. It probably tells us something about the cost of living, but also the economic vibrancy and what are the opportunities for households to earn more income in different parts of the state. Now, that regional picture is certainly interesting, but if you break it down to the local level using the same data set, you do get a little bit more of a varied picture. I'll say these are the same data, but again, shifted a little earlier, 2013 to 2017. Now, again, these median household income estimates by municipality are limited in that we don't have very much data for some of these small communities. So the way that you can get around that a little bit and still have it sort of inform the conversation is it different? Is it clearly different, or can we have some high level of confidence that the median household income in a community is different from the statewide median? So for example, places like Errol and Hart's Location and Newcastle, you don't have very much information. Indeed, for Newcastle, there's a median household income estimate in the latest data set, but the margin of error is $45,000 in either direction, which is obviously a significant margin of error, a significant income range. So it's not very useful for comparing municipality to municipality, but compared to the state, we can learn a little bit about where the patterns of income are around the state. And so this map shows in green the communities where we can say with 90% confidence that the median household income is higher than the statewide median. The red communities are those that are lower than the statewide median in terms of their median household income. And those in gold or yellow are statistically indistinguishable. We don't know, based on these data, whether it's actually different. And that could be because they're very close or because of population size or some combination of both. But you can see a regional pattern here. You can see some variation, which is not a surprise based on the county map. But you can also see that there are communities in most parts of the state where you'll have neighboring communities that have what appear to be rather different median household incomes, even though they're otherwise right next to each other, geographically proximate. And that tells us something about what the fiscal capacity is, the relative fiscal capacity is in those communities. And part of the reason why we can be, even though there's some uncertainty here, we can be confident about what some of these data are telling us is that if you look historically, a lot of the regional patterns that we see are relatively stable. So from 2007 to 2011, you'll see on the map on your left, and from 2012 to 2016, you see on the map on your right, You know, there are a lot of similar patterns to what we just saw in the 2013 to 2017 map in between these two completely different sets of collected data. That being said, there are certainly some communities that have changed color, if you will, relative to the median household income of the state. So it tells us some things, but is not necessarily reliable in and of itself, especially if you're comparing community to community in a linear fashion. It's better for comparisons that allow you to sort of categorize them because some of these data are so uncertain. Now, those are survey data, and I just caveated survey data quite a bit in terms of what the value is available there. But what about program data? And free and reduced price school lunch enrollment is an example of program data. We are able to say, what's the count of students who are eligible and live in a certain municipality? However, the downside of program data is that usually people have to take some sort of action. Usually have to enroll in the program or make themselves aware, or make the program aware of them. And programs don't necessarily measure exactly what you might want to be measuring. So if you're trying to measure poverty or median household income, survey data are less reliable in terms of their statistical uncertainty, but are actually trying to measure that. Whereas program data are usually measuring something that's related to the program, which may not be directly related to income or whether someone is in or poverty or not. Medicaid is an example of such a means-tested program that does try to get at what is the income level of an individual. This map shows the percentage of the population enrolled in Medicaid by municipality in September 2019. So some people may be enrolled in Medicaid for different reasons. There are different facets of the program that have different income levels. So it's a valuable indicator for where there may be a greater percentage of the population who's lower income, but it's probably a more valuable indicator for what are the needs in the communities. What percentage of the population is enrolled in Medicaid because of either a health complexity or their income or a combination of their income and wealth, making them eligible. So that provides you with some measurement, but it's a little less clear cut because in part Medicaid is such a large multifaceted program. The food stamp program, however, is a little bit more clear cut in terms of if someone is income or a combination of income and wealth eligible, then they can enroll in the program. And the food stamp program is also very responsive to a recession and it does interact with other programs, but doesn't include nearly as many facets as the Medicaid program. So this map shows the food stamp program enrollment as a percentage of municipal population. These data are unfortunately a little less direct. They're not as easy to get to as the Medicaid enrollment data, but there are data collected like Medicaid every month, which is more frequent than some of the measures, and allows you to sort of see what the changes are over time between communities in a very granular way. And as you can see, there's variation that's within regions here as well. The southeastern part of the state tends to have a lower percentage of the population enrolled in Medicaid, but all you have to do is look at individual communities, including individual communities that are often similar in size and right next to each other. Dover and Rochester come to mind, that have quite different percentages of the population enrolled in the food stamp program. So this is another one that tries to get at measuring income. So we have this combination of income measurements from survey data and from program data. What do they look like when you put them together? So of all the slides I've shown you so far, this is the one with the newest data behind it supporting it. This graph is telling us 4 things about what we know about community income. First, of those 4 measures, each bubble is a municipality and the size of that bubble shows municipal population. Food stamp program enrollment as a percentage of the population is measured on the horizontal axis. And free and reduced price school meal enrollment as a percentage of resident students is measured on the vertical axis. And the colors represent those median household incomes from the survey data relative to the statewide median. So again, red is lower and green is higher. So you'll see here as examples, this large red dot is Manchester. So Manchester is the largest dot on here because it has the highest population, and is also about 12.5% of Manchester's population is enrolled in the food stamp program, and a little bit more than 60% based on these data, which are adequate education aid data, not the most recent school district data. This adequate education aid data shows that about 60% of the student population is free and reduced price school meal eligible. So the fact that these are all income data and they're trending together gives us added confidence that these measures are useful both individually and collectively. However, these data do tell us different things about communities, particularly relative to income in communities for students versus non-student households. And we can see that there are some municipalities that actually deviate on the upper side of this line, if you will, that suggests that students may come from disproportionately lower income households relative to the community as a whole. We can also see that there are communities, most notably Nashua, which is the largest yellow bubble here, where median household incomes may be higher than one might expect given the levels of food stamp and free and reduced price school meal enrollment, which could tell us something about the distribution of incomes within those communities. And that potentially tells us something different about the fiscal capacity of the community than any one of these measures on their own. But of course, with survey data, we have to be careful about reading too much into results from low population communities. Now, speaking of population, one indicator, which is definitely a more sort of generic sort of step back, and there's a lot of variables that go into it, but one indicator of whether a community is doing well or not, maybe whether it's attracting residents. And while population growth and economic vibrancy are not always necessarily moving together at all, and there may be many reasons why a population is growing or not in a community that is attracting residents is likely providing desirable places to live, including amenities such as proximity to commercial and public services and school districts. So you can see on this map, for example, the communities in blue are those that have a faster rate of growth than the state as a whole and relative to estimates from 2010 to 2018. Those that are more rust-colored are those that either have population growth, but it's lower than the statewide population growth, or have seen population declines. So again, if you were to put these together, if you were to sort of conduct an exercise and try to combine these to understand what are the communities that have a potentially less favorable outcome on these indicators than the statewide equivalent for that indicator, then it gives you a little bit of a picture when you're thinking about what are the communities that may be in the most economic need or have the least fiscal capacity. Now, this map is not a perfect metric by any means, and it's based on some data that we've now had updates to. But it shows potentially the power of and usefulness of combining some of these indicators to direct aid. So here, just in a binary indicator, is it, or is the community, or is it not, potentially on the unfavorable side of the ledger relative to these 7 metrics? There are 36 communities that are identified. That tells us something about their local economies and fiscal capacities. Now, you would want comprehensive, longitudinal, non-binary metrics that are likely best used in combination with one another, but the available data do limit your ability to do that, especially around community income. But there are other ways to measure the ability of a community to pay for education locally. And with more measures, generally, we can increase our confidence as to what is happening on the ground or understanding what is happening on the ground in these communities, especially when they point in a similar direction relative to statewide figures. So, as a reminder, measuring economic well-being comprehensively at the local level is difficult. There are limited data that are available for us to be able to do that. I've run through a few of the examples of some of those data here. Free and reduced price school meal eligibility and taxable property value per student are 2 key and direct ones. There are other metrics, including ones that we haven't summarized here, that are available and may be important, but no metric is perfect, and each provides different information. In combination, however, they can maybe tell us a little bit more than we would otherwise know about access to opportunity and upward mobility in a community, which can have a profound impact on that on the ability of that community to invest in itself and in its children's future. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to any questions you may have for us.
Phil, thank you. I know Dave's.
So much.
There you go, Dave. Good, you're on.
Yeah, I'm not sure how my internet has sort of been unstable the 10 minutes. So, can people hear me?
Yes, Dave.
I don't know. Yeah, is that all right? Phil, that really tremendous. and Marie very much for that. Let me open up to the floor for questions. Yeah, I see a couple hands. Chris Dwyer, your first time on today.
I think the last couple of slides that you showed were really interesting. I'm interested in particularly in that slide that illustrated that within communities, if we looked at the average figures, there's still a fair amount of population, the distribution of population in terms of need, free and reduced lunch, might be pretty wide. And I wonder how, if you've looked at how the variation, I suppose, by larger standard deviations would correlate or relate to property wealth per capita or per student capita.
Yeah, so the property wealth per capita versus income question is, in terms of graphing it on those two axes, is a great one. That is not an analysis that we have done yet. That analysis was just to look at, do these income measurements trend together? And they do generally, although they tell us some things sort of on the margins. Whether it matches the property wealth per capita or not is, I think, an excellent question, and one that's certainly worth our consideration. We haven't done that analysis yet at this point. But I can tell you that if you look at the two maps, and I should say there are interactive versions of the maps that were in our 2018 report that are on our website. So if you want to, if you haven't memorized all the borders of all the municipalities yet in New Hampshire and want to explore which ones are which and see the data behind them, there are interactive versions on our website. And if you look at those two maps layered together, there are certainly places where you have high property wealth communities where the income indicators are not necessarily high, and vice versa.
Yeah, Dave's still got a lot of instability, so I'll continue with the Q&A. Rick has a hand up.
Thank you very much, Bruce. There were two of these maps which really impressed me. I like very much the combined indicators relative to the state. I think there's one way of looking at the state that really causes me some heartache, and that's the median household income estimates by county. I look at Grafton County, which I live within, and this afternoon after this meeting, I have to drive down to Hanover. And I'm going to pass through Piermont, then I'm going to go into Orford, then Lyme, and then finally Hanover. As I go south, the median family incomes just climb. I looked at the 2017 figures I found on the web just a few minutes before I got online here today. And Hanover has $118,000 plus average median income. And then I look at Lyme, it's 108. It's coming a little further north. And then Orford is 81,000. And by the time I get up to Haverhill, I'm down around 50,000. And so I've had some folks talking to me, well, we should maybe figure some of this out by counties. I think there's too many high points and low points within the counties for us to just use that one indicator.
Yeah, and I would add on to that. It's a little bit less less fair, if you will, to some of the other counties in the state. But the largest county in the state, Hillsborough County, in terms of population, I think that's a great example of the gradation that we see. Grafton County is another one. With Hillsborough County, you have Manchester and Nashua, which are two different cities that are maybe facing different challenges when it comes to school funding. And then right next to them, you have a lot of communities that are along the Merrimack River Valley that are smaller communities that tend to be higher income communities and have a little bit more ready transportation access to metropolitan Boston, for example, or access to other employment opportunities in New Hampshire. Then you move further west in Hillsborough County, and you start to see the incomes drop, and you start to see lower income communities and lower property value communities that may be lower income communities for a very different set of reasons, or have a very different set of factors that contribute to those communities still within Hillsborough County, like Bennington and Greenville being lower income communities, but still within the same county as Manchester, Nashua, Merrimack, et cetera. And that's when you look at the county level figures, you miss that nuance, and that nuance is part of what we're trying to get at with this analysis at the community level. Unfortunately, you don't have many of the indicators nearly as reliably at the local level as you do at the county level. But from what you can learn from the indicators that are available at the local level, there's quite a bit of great variation even between neighboring communities. Even on a shorter drive than from Haverhill to Hanover, you can cross a border and have a very different, what would be a fiscal capacity at the local level. And Grafton County is another example of where, when you're looking at averages and medians, you have a population center that is in the southwestern corner of the county, and you have a highway going through the eastern part of the county, and there's a lot of variation in between. Indeed, one of the measures that we did look at for our 2018 report is the percentage of tax returns from the IRS, from the Internal Revenue Service, the percentage of tax returns that reported more than $100,000 in income by zip code. Unfortunately, it's not available in my municipality, which complicates its usefulness as one of these metrics. But those are, again, it's a program, so those are relatively complete data. There's a lot of parsing that you have to do to really measure what you want to. But if you look at just the percentage of incomes that are in a zip code that are over $100,000, Grafton County had the highest and the lowest, all within zip codes within its county. So you lose that if you just look at county metrics.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Dick, James?
Yeah, hi, Phil. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So there's, in Massachusetts, they have an effort index that helps to determine what they call a minimum required local contribution. And the effort index uses both property value per pupil, I think, and an income factor. Do you have knowledge of how they measure income? I think what you're telling us is that we don't have good enough data to drive an income factor, municipality or school district by school district, municipality by municipality. Could you comment on that?
Sure. So there are some federal measures. For example, the Department of Housing and Urban Development at the federal level does try to model what an income measure maybe, or what a poverty index may be at the local level, really at the census tract level at that point. When we're talking about American Community Survey data, however, I agree that I would really caution using any sort of median household income estimate, especially if you're not accounting for what the margin of error is. When you're comparing communities to each other, especially when you're getting down to municipalities or school districts that may only include 1,000 or 2,000 residents or considerably less, those American Community Survey data, which usually when we're talking about measuring median household income, we're using at the state or level or more local, we're using the American Community Survey. The reliability breaks down quite a bit, especially if you're talking about relying on it to make public policy decisions that are more granular than, so what we presented here. Is this a community that we can say with some level of certainty it's higher or lower income than the statewide median? So there are, I'm not saying there aren't ways to get to it. There are ways that you can get to it in terms of metrics that are available and often calculated and modeled to try and understand what the median household income is in a community. But there are lots of caveats around those, and it's very important to understand where they come from, because at a fundamental level, when we're talking about survey data, we only have so much, and there are a lot of very low population communities in New Hampshire that if you're trying to measure with those, then one of the results may be that even if you do rolling averages over time, you have large swings from year to year. And those large swings from year to year are something that if you're basing, budgeting and aid decisions on, could cause some complications and questions because of the uncertainty in the survey data. There are ways that you can smooth that. There are ways that you can model that, but it does get very complicated, and you only have so much data to base it on to begin with, which is the primary caution there, and why we used the statistical significance testing.
So Bill has his hand up, and then maybe one more question after that, and we're going to do a few things to get ready for next week's meeting before
Thank
public
you.
comment period.
And Mary Ann, Anne Marie, and Phil, thank you so much. Great presentation. I really appreciate it. You mentioned the statistics of income, the IRS data by zip code. That database is fun to look at. It has adjusted gross income by, 03301, 03302. Is there any way, getting to Dick's question, that IRS data could be used to get an assessment of the relative income capacity of a particular community? Thank you again very much.
Yes, absolutely. So what you'd have to do is you either have to make some assumptions about parsing those zip code data among school district borders, or layering it on top of other available data, right? And being able to say, this is a community where, whatever your measure may be, this is a community where we know from these tax returns, these ones were joint filers, these ones were individual filers, will weight according to that. We know that the income per capita of the people that filed, because remember, there are a fair number of people who don't file federal income taxes, so it's an incomplete picture, even though we have precision around the data that we have for zip codes. We have precision, but not necessarily accuracy. Those data, you could layer them on. You could say, here's, based on these zip code data, we know something else. But again, I think it has to be used in concert with other things, because it's just a shaft of light into what does this slice of the pie look like, right? What is this, what do we know given this set? It could be that the IRS may be willing to work with the state to provide more granular data in terms of municipal level. I can't volunteer the IRS to do that. That is a possibility. And I think that there's, to the extent that you could use zip code data, either if there's some GIS capability around really pinpointing what the population divisions are between municipalities within a zip code, then I think there's a way that you could get to it with enough precision and sort of fortitude in the data that you could use it, potentially for public policy decisions. Again, school districts and zip codes and municipalities don't overlap well, unfortunately. It would take quite a bit of engineering to get them to sync up well, but it's certainly possible.
Thank you. Chris.
I wonder if it would be useful to look at some of the indicators as they relate to the current communities that are quote, excess swept communities, in order to kind of test out the degree to which the current approach, where it might be, quote, aligned, and where it might be off base. Just from eyeballing some of your maps, knowing some of the excess swept communities, it seems to me that there's some stereotypes that people hold in their heads that are just not true of those communities, particularly the variability, particularly your Medicaid, your food stamps, the variability in poverty. And that might, I don't know if that would illuminate anything for us, but that might make sure we don't make some of the same mistakes again.
Yeah, so, and I'll layer on there just anecdotally, I know that Wolfboro is one of the communities that I believe is an excess swept community, as you referred to it as, and is also a community where the median household income is lower than the statewide median in a statistically significant fashion in the 2013 to 2017 data. So that's an example of when you're thinking about who's the population there and what is the property wealth there, you see very different pictures. And that is something that if you're just taking one of the metrics, you don't see, which is why it's important to sort of think about these and think about what these local economies are in a sort of holistic fashion to the extent that we can with the available data.
And Jay, and then we'll probably move on.
Oops, better ask a good one then. So Phil, the mapping capabilities that you just demonstrated are very great, quick studies of regional differences, and I think or municipality town differences. That was really very helpful to see the data that way. So here, I like the way that you gathered 7 statistics, and you essentially then mapped how many score a 7, how many communities score 7 versus how many score 0, right?
Yes, just the binary measures.
If we view that as a vertical axis from 0 to 7, and we look at achievement, how students succeed in their schools on a horizontal axis from low to high, we ought to see if there's a strong relationship between poverty and low achievement. We would see, I'm going the wrong way now, but we would see a graph that goes like this, right? We would see low achievement over here, and the 7 indices, that'd be up here, and then could you map something like that? If our consultant produces data that gives us achievement by town or school district, and we know these characteristics of communities, we should be able to show the correlation between the two, right?
Yeah, I think that doing that regression would be possible. Yes, I would say that the 1 to 7 indicators is, I think, certainly interesting. I think what's more helpful is looking at each individual indicator relative to it to make sure that we're not losing something in the aggregation. Because again, that map as an exercise that's just a binary, did you meet this threshold or not? And if we're trying to understand what are the factors that contribute to it, looking at those individually as well as in aggregate, or aggregating them perhaps in a different way, may be more useful. But certainly looking at those 7 indicators and seeing what is the trend is what I think, again, be an interesting exercise. And I know that Reaching Higher New Hampshire has also done some research around what are some of those causal or I should say correlating indicators, pardon me. And they found that free and reduced price school meals, I believe, was one of the indicators that did have an effect there, but I don't want to speak to their research. But imagining something along those lines, those 0 through 7 indicators, and comparing those to outcomes would certainly be interesting. And it would tell us, something about those indicators in aggregate stacked up that way. I think that more informative may be layering through and looking at the raw data versus the raw data, and really seeing sort of what some of those trends are, so it's not as muddled a picture.
Yeah, I guess it winds up us having to select the absolute best variable, and I think just as the discussion was about income, household income, there's a shot to be taken at each variable and its flaws, which is why the composite is, it's why people use composite indices, right?
And I think that using composite indices is a great way to approach it and to move forward. I think building those composite indices is something you want to do carefully and understand each composite indicator's pluses and minuses. And that, sort of 0 through 7 scale is a very sort of blunt instrument way to look at some of the focusing, right? It is that binary scale or that binary yes or no doesn't allow for sort of the nuance that I think and the weighting that maybe should be applied to the different indicators individually.
That's a good point. Thanks.
Thank you.
So Dave, can I turn it back to you? Do you want to drive now?
Sure. Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, and thanks for that. I'll have to go back to the recording for some of this. I'm running off a Verizon hotspot now, which is actually doing better than the Xfinity link at the moment. So let's see. Actually, I don't have. I've changed computer too, so I actually don't have the agenda up. I know we wanted to do a quick. work group, or no, we're actually going to go right to public comment.
Well, no, just one little step in between, if I might. I just wanted to let people know how we're going to set up next week's extended 3.5-hour meeting.
Let's do
we'll
that.
incorporate work group reports into that for sure. But let me bring up where we want to head next week. We're going to reground ourselves in our design thinking framework that we began with in the late winter, early spring, before COVID interrupted us. But what I'm going to do is we're going to focus next week on thinking about what we've learned so far. So there's a series of questions here that we assigned to our design thinking in phase 2, which was ostensibly April through July, and we're actually sort of on that timeline. There's a series of questions there to help us focus on learning as much as we can about the problem. Phase 3, which goes August to October, begins to identify solutions and options and ways to test those options. So we're not there yet, and the cost modeling that AIR is doing, which they'll be presenting to us at our August 10th full commission meeting, will begin to move us into phase 3. So for next week, what we're going to ask you to reflect on, and I'll send this out to everybody as an email, is the 9 questions that were the focus back in phase 2, this April through July phase, which we're now coming to a close with. And so how well have we answered those questions? Where are there significant gaps in our knowledge or process that we want to attend to at this point? What options might we begin to set aside at this point? And that question may be premature, but we've identified, at least in our conversations, some pathways that we really probably are not going to pursue as we begin to frame out options for solving the school funding challenge. So that's just it's a placeholder question, but I want to begin for us to hone in on what options are less likely to survive the conversation. And then what do you hope to learn from the cost modeling preliminary findings that are going to be presented to us by AAR August 10th? So part of our conversation on July 27th, we'll help AIR shape its presentation to us of its initial cost model, which right now is scheduled, for August 10th. So this will be generally our conversation a week from today. In addition to the work group reports, we do end up sort of jumping past those at most of our full commission meetings simply because of time. And so with a good solid 3.5-hour time commitment next week, we'll be able to do that as well. We will take a break in the middle of that long session next week, just to give people some relief. We'll work as a committee of the whole next week. The Zoom webinar format that we're using doesn't allow us to break into small groups. And also when you break into small groups, you lose the opportunity for the public to be fully present for all of the deliberations. So we want to protect that principle as well. But again, I'll be sending this out to you, reminding you to be sure that you're familiar with all the AIR briefs that we've received to date, as well as the other supplementary material that we have available to us, including court decisions and interim reports, and the kind of material that the Fiscal Policy Institute has provided to us today, the notes that were taken by Ann Edwards, really helpful and detailed presentation today as well, in addition to the prior meeting minutes and PowerPoints and reports that have been shared with us up to this point. So we really are roughly at our halfway mark, and it's time to take stock and begin to turn towards the work that will be taking place August through October. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Dave for public comments.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. Really, really well said. Really looking forward to next Monday. We do have Adequacy Work Group meeting on Thursday this week. What time's that?
That's 3 o'clock until 5 o'clock. Jordan has sent out that reminder and that link. And so it's an Adequacy Work Group meeting, but as always, we'll have lots of other commission representation.
Right, and that's the thing I wanted to point out too. Even though we're not doing our sort of summaries on some of these commission meetings, we get so many commission members at all work group meetings. It's really great to see. I mean, the amount of time that all of us, that everybody on the commission has been putting in is just been extraordinary, and well, it's an enormous amount of work.
Just as a teaser, and I think this will, given today's two presentations, the focus of the adequacy work group right now is the current definitions of adequacy, excuse me, in state statutes and as implied by DOE regulations and standards. So there's the definitional piece, and we got a lot of cautions in our first presentation today about what it means to define adequacy and then live up to that definition. And the work group is grappling with how adequacy is costed by statute and by DOE calculations. And then we also have that per pupil figure out there as another benchmark. And the adequacy work group is trying to understand where on that continuum from base adequacy to per pupil, what that tells us about what we know about what it costs to educate a child in New Hampshire. And Anne's notion of moving away from a per pupil calculation to what does it cost to run a school calculation is pretty intriguing, and I think complicated and difficult as well. So we'll be grappling with some of those things on Thursday.
Great, great. Thanks, Bruce. I do want to take some public comment. So I think we've got a few people that are still with us right now. And if you're on Zoom video, if you can just click the raise your hand part, and if you're on phone, it's *9. And Jordan, can you take care of letting people in here? I think Diane's got her hand up.
Good afternoon. This is Diane LaChance. I live in Hopkinton, New Hampshire. I spoke last week at the public comment period that was set aside just for public comment, and I let people know that I've only recently started to listen to all the hard work everyone is doing, so I'm not quite prepared to speak. But in looking into the work you're doing, I've been asking a number of other people in the state who typically get involved in these type of conversations on such an important matter. And I've been really surprised that some of these people have said, I didn't believe there was any public comment available. I looked at the listing you have of the meetings, and I see last week's opportunity and one more opportunity in August. I was not expecting a public comment period at the end of this discussion. So the only comment I want to make today is there may be an issue with the general public understanding where they can participate in this process. Again, I've only been involved since last week, but I am kind of surprised that I'm not seeing a lot of typical people who get involved in these discussions talking about what's going on. So I'm just giving you a heads up. I do appreciate all the hard work you're doing. I'm saving a lot of my comments till I've had time to listen to the work you've already done, so I can respect that first. And thank you very much. That's all I have to say today.
Great, thanks. Anybody else, I guess something they want to share for the good of the cause? I'm not seeing other hands, going once, going twice. I think everybody's chatted out for today, Bruce.
Okay. All right, and we will be sure to continue to post meeting agendas, including public comment time periods. We will be extending public comment into the fall on a more regular basis in the additional time slots beyond the full commission meetings. And so we encourage folks to look at the website for the commission at carc.unh.edu/school-funding, or just simply Google school funding, Carsey School, and you'll get to us and be able to be aware of agendas and plan public comment periods.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Anybody else, anything for the good of the cause here? There's been a long day so far in meetings, so and I think there's still a few more ahead. I want to thank Ann Edwards again, and thank Anne Marie and Phil for really fantastic presentation and Q&A today. I really appreciate it all so much. So thank you guys very much. And I know we'll be talking with you as this continues to move forward. And we'll see everybody Thursday, if not before, certainly a week from today too. So great. Take care.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.